In the small town of Willow Creek, Tennessee, dawn crept over the rolling hills, painting the rooftops with a soft amber glow. At the intersection of Cedar Lane and Maple Drive stood the Hearthstone Diner, a modest establishment that had been the heartbeat of the community since 1948. Its walls, adorned with black and white photographs, told stories of the town's pride. Loggers who carved their lives from the forests, teachers who shaped young minds, and soldiers who answered their country's call. The diner was a sanctuary for those who carried the weight of their pasts, a place where time seemed to pause, if only for a cup of coffee. Eleanor Voss, 58, had been the diner's soul for nearly 3 decades. She moved with the grace of someone who knew every creak in the floorboards, her auburn hair tied back in a loose bun. She knew that Clara Hensley liked her tea with 2 spoons of honey, that Pastor Amos preferred decaf after noon, and that Samuel Whitaker, a wiry man in his late 70s, arrived every morning at 7:10 sharp. Samuel always took the same seat by the window, ordering black coffee, rye toast, and a small dish of peach preserves. He carried 3 things that seemed to anchor him: a neatly folded copy of the Willow Creek Gazette, a silver pocket watch inherited from his father, a Korean War veteran, and a quiet presence that filled the air like the scent of rain-soaked earth. Samuel's routine was unshakable. He hung his faded navy jacket on the chair, its fabric worn thin at the elbows, and settled into his seat. His hands, etched with the lines of a long life, trembled faintly when the conversation turned to war, though he never spoke of it. Unlike the other veterans who spun tales of valor over their eggs, Samuel was a shadow in the room, steady, unassuming, a man who carried his history in silence. The diner's patrons treated him with an unspoken respect. Eleanor always refilled his coffee without prompting. Jonas Reed, a carpenter with calloused hands, saved the morning paper for him on late days. Martha Klein, a retired librarian widowed by a distant conflict, always checked the sky and offered him a ride when rain loomed. These were small acts, instinctive, as if the town sensed Samuel was more than he appeared. But not everyone saw him that way. Victor Grayson, a former Army major, had blown into Willow Creek 3 years prior, carrying the swagger of a man who thrived on attention. At 52, Victor had spent his career behind desks, managing logistics and paperwork far from the chaos of combat. Yet he spoke as if he'd stormed beaches and led charges, his voice booming across the diner with stories of revolutionizing supply chains at Fort Campbell. His polished boots gleamed under the diner's fluorescent lights, and he carried a sleek leather satchel stuffed with commendations and photos of himself with colonels. Victor's sharp gray suit stood in stark contrast to Samuel's threadbare jacket, and he made no effort to hide his disdain. "Look at that coat," Victor scoffed one chilly morning, his voice cutting through the hum of conversation. Frost clung to the diner's windows, and Samuel sat quietly, sipping his coffee. "A veteran ought to carry himself with pride. That thing looks like it's been through a shredder." The room stilled. Eleanor's rag paused mid-wipe on the counter. Samuel folded his newspaper with deliberate care, slipped the pocket watch into his pocket, and left a few coins on the table. A modest tip, as always, despite his frugal life. He stood, his knees creaking, and walked to the door. Victor's words followed him. "You're letting us all down, old man." Samuel paused, his hand on the doorknob, and glanced back. His pale blue eyes held Victor's for a moment, heavy with a story no one could read. Then he stepped outside, the bell above the door chiming softly. Victor leaned back, satisfied, mistaking silence for defeat. He didn't know he'd just insulted a man whose courage dwarfed his own. Willow Creek's Veterans Hall stood at the edge of the town square, a sturdy limestone building framed by ancient sycamores that whispered in the autumn breeze. Built in 1968 with donations scraped together by the townsfolk, it was a quiet monument to those who served. Inside, oak shelves held weathered books on military campaigns, from Antietam to Kandahar, their pages yellowed but cherished. The walls bore photographs of young men and women in crisp uniforms, some smiling with the optimism of youth, others staring solemnly, as if they knew what lay ahead. A bronze plaque listed the names of those who never returned, their names catching the dim light that filtered through tall, arched patas de gallo windows. Every Saturday at 8 a.m., Samuel Whitaker arrived at the hall with a canvas bag of cleaning supplies, all bought with his own modest pension. His routine was sacred. He straightened the frames with a carpenter's precision, dusted the books with care, and mended torn pages with delicate strips of tape. On a shelf he'd built himself, he placed fresh wildflowers, asters and goldenrod, changed weekly, their colors a quiet tribute to the fallen. Each photograph received his attention, his cloth moving gently over the faces of soldiers frozen in time. To Samuel, they were more than images. They were kin, bound by the unspoken bond of sacrifice. Victor Grayson, oblivious to this ritual, continued his campaign of disdain at the Hearthstone Diner. His jabs at Samuel grew sharper, like a blade honed by repetition. "No pride," he'd mutter, loud enough for the room to hear. "A man who served should at least dress the part." Samuel never rose to the bait. His silence a fortress Victor mistook for weakness. The other patrons, Eleanor, Jonas, Martha, watched with tight lips, their loyalty to Samuel unspoken, but fierce. They knew something Victor didn't. Samuel's humility was not a flaw, but a testament to a strength he couldn't fathom. November 11th arrived, crisp and clear, the town square adorned with American flags snapping in the wind. The Veterans Day ceremony drew a small crowd to the hall, chairs arranged in neat rows before a wooden stage. Samuel sat in the back, his navy jacket blending into the shadows of the leafless sycamores. Victor, in a pressed uniform adorned with unearned bravado, worked the crowd, shaking hands as if running for office. The mayor spoke of duty, the pastor prayed for peace, and the high school band played a slightly off-key rendition of Sweet Caroline. The guest speaker, General Margaret Holt, 67, took the stage. Her weathered face spoke of battles fought in Desert Storm and Somalia. She scanned the crowd, her gaze sharp, trained to spot what others missed. Then she saw him, Samuel, in his faded jacket, a faint embroidered patch on his chest catching her eye. She knew that symbol, rare and sacred. Setting aside her notes, she stepped down from the stage and approached him. "May I?" she asked softly, gesturing to the patch. Samuel nodded, his expression unreadable. General Holt leaned in, her breath catching as she confirmed the emblem. She stood, snapped a salute, and turned to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are in the presence of a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient awarded for extraordinary valor beyond the call of duty." The crowd gasped. Victor, half rising, froze, his face a mask of disbelief. One by one, the townsfolk stood, saluting Samuel, children mimicking their parents, veterans with tears in their eyes. Samuel rose slowly, his frame slight but steady, and returned a quiet nod. The square fell silent, the weight of truth reshaping the air. The Veterans Day ceremony left Willow Creek buzzing, the revelation about Samuel Whitaker rippling through the town like a stone dropped in still water. Victor Grayson, for once, was speechless. That night he lay awake, the general's words looping in his mind. Congressional Medal of Honor, how could he have missed it? The old man in the worn jacket, the one he'd mocked for months, carried a legacy Victor could only dream of. Shame settled in his chest, heavy as wet clay. The next morning, Victor arrived at the Hearthstone Diner before dawn, his polished boots dull under the weight of his thoughts. He took a seat near Samuel's usual corner, the table by the window still empty. The diner hummed with its usual rhythm. Eleanor pouring coffee, the clink of plates, the low murmur of conversation. But today, Victor listened instead of speaking. Martha Klein, her voice soft, recounted how Samuel had pulled her granddaughter, Lila, from a frozen creek last winter. 76 years old, and he dove in like he was half that age, she said, her eyes misty. Gone before we could even thank him. Jonas Reed leaned in, his voice gruff. You know he funds the Veterans Hall upkeep himself? Every flower, every polish on those plaques, it's all him. Victor's coffee grew cold in his hands. Each story was a brick, building a portrait of a man he'd misjudged. He thought of every barb he'd thrown, about Samuel's jacket, his quiet demeanor, his supposed lack of pride. The words now tasted like ash. He left a $10 bill on the table, a tip far larger than his usual, and stepped into the morning chill, driven by a need to make things right. At 10 a.m., Victor pulled up to Samuel's modest home, a gray clapboard cottage with a sagging porch on Sycamore Street. He knocked, but no one answered. A neighbor, an elderly woman tending her roses, glanced over. "Looking for Sam? He's at the Veterans Hall on Saturdays. Always is." Victor nodded, his throat tight, and drove to the town square. The Veterans Hall stood bathed in soft light, its limestone walls glowing under the morning sun. Victor pushed open the glass door and stepped inside. Samuel was there, kneeling before a photograph, his cloth moving gently over the frame of a young soldier's face. The air smelled of lemon polish and fresh wildflowers. Samuel stood slowly, his joints creaking, and turned to face Victor. For a moment, neither spoke. "Samuel," Victor began, his voice unsteady, "I came to apologize. I've been a fool, judging you, thinking I was better. I said things I can't take back." Samuel regarded him, his pale blue eyes steady, then turned back to the photograph, resuming his work. "No need," he said simply, his voice low but firm. "There is," Victor insisted, stepping closer. "I spent years building myself up, thinking I was the biggest man in the room. But you're the one who's done what matters." Samuel paused, his cloth still in hand. "I just did what was needed," he said, his gaze returning to the photograph. "Still do." Victor stood there, the weight of his mistake pressing against his ribs. "Can I help?" he asked, almost a whisper. Samuel handed him a clean cloth, pointing to the other side of the wall. "Start there." They worked in silence, side by side, dusting the faces of soldiers who'd never come home. The room was quiet, save for the soft rustle of their cloths and the distant chirp of sparrows outside. No words were needed. Some lessons are taught not through speeches, but through the steady rhythm of action. By noon the photographs gleamed. The shelves where Raspberry Pi were perfectly aligned. Victor handed Samuel the cloth and stepped back, his hands trembling slightly. Samuel nodded once, a gesture of acceptance. They parted without fanfare, but something had shifted. Victor drove away with a new truth in his heart. Courage doesn't shout. It simply does what must be done. The town of Willow Creek would never see Samuel the same way again, and neither would Victor.